Welcome. Bienvenidas a todas. I'm Catherine Tracy Good, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, the director of the Tools for Researchers program at the Americas Research Network, or ARENET, and I'm so happy that you've been able to join us for this special presentation in our Researching the Americas series. We are thrilled to have Dr. Cynthia Radding giving a Conferencia Magistral as our final presentation of 2020, Indigenous Spaces and Environmental Transformations, Defending the Boundaries of the Yoreme World. The conference is part of her current research project, Bountiful Deserts, Imperial Shadows, which explores the ecological transition between wild and cultivated plants, the cultural intersections of sedentary and nomadic peoples, and the production of knowledge in northern Mexico. Today's presentation emphasizes the spatial and historical dynamic of changing territorial boundaries and community formation among different indigenous ethnic clusters in the context of colonialism and Spanish settlement in northwestern New Spain. Her analysis of land titles and complementary documentary and anthropological testimonies provides an avenue to a new interpretation of the history of the Yoreme communities in the Mayo River Valley of present-day southern Sonora. Before we get started, just a few words on logistics. After the interview, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. To participate in the Q&A, please send a message via the chat function at the bottom of the screen with your question. We will put you in the virtual queue when it is your turn, and then unmute you individually so you can ask your question directly. The system has changed a little bit with Zoom, so we will then ask you to unmute yourself. So if you want to ask a question, be prepared to unmute yourself after we've requested that you do so. Please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to ARENET's various platforms. By participating in the Q&A, you are giving your consent to being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded but would like to ask a question, I will be happy to read your question from the chat for you. Now, let me introduce you to Dr. Cynthia Radding. Cynthia Radding is the chair of the ARENET Board of Directors and the Gussenhoven Distinguished Professor of History and Latin American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her scholarship is rooted in the imperial borderlands of the Spanish and Portuguese American empires, emphasizing the role of indigenous peoples and other colonized groups in shaping those borderlands, transforming their landscapes, and producing colonial societies. She is past president of the Conference on Latin American History. She served as book review editor of the Hispanic American Historical Review, the HAHR, and on the editorial boards of the American Historical Review, the HHR, and the Americas, as well as on the advisory council of the Inter-American Foundation. She is co-editor of The Borderlands of the Iberian World with Dana Levin Rojo, which is one of ARENET's biggest projects of the last few years, a multi-authored Oxford University Press handbook published in 2019. Amongst her publications, her books Landscapes of Power and Identity, Comparative Histories in the Sonoran Desert and the Forests of Amazonia from Colony to Republic, and Wandering Peoples, Colonialism, Ethnic Spaces, and Ecological Frontiers, Northwestern Mexico 1700 to 1850, have both been translated and published in Spanish, and she co-edited the book Borderlands in World History. Her recent articles include Indigenous Landscapes in Northwestern New Spain, Environmental History Through Contested Boundaries and Colonial Land Claims in the journal Resilience, a journal of environmental humanities, Leyendo los paisajes en los archivos históricos, los jesuitas y los pueblos de indios en la producción del espacio en el noroeste de Nueva España, en Nuevo Mundo, Mundos Nuevos, and Palabras de Protesta en Demanda de Justicia, Frontera Novo Mexicana, siglo XVII, in the book Los Indios ante la Justicia Local. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to Dr. Radding.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank Tracy Good and Greta de Leon for their kind invitation to share some of my work with you today. And I thank all of you, friends, students, colleagues, for joining us as we approach a very unusual holiday season around the world. I look forward to your questions and comments and the discussion that we will have during this session of Researching the Americas. The title of the series, begun this year by the Americas Research Network, seems straightforward enough, but it opens to us possibilities for thinking about the histories of different regions within the vast continents of the Western Hemisphere in new ways. We see a little more clearly the common threads of cultural encounters, environmental transformations, and power struggles across different regions and time periods in North and Central and South America. It helps us to critique the notion of Latin America as just everything south of the Rio Bravo, and to heighten our awareness of the ways that particular regional histories play into broader global contexts. For today's presentation, I will turn to the regional history of Indigenous communal strategies for survival and negotiation in the colonial frontier of northern Mexico. The concept of Indigenous spaces expresses the historical dynamic of changing territorial boundaries and community formation among different ethnic clusters in the context of colonialism and Spanish settlement in northwestern New Spain, that is, what Mexico was called in the colonial period. This contribution seeks to open new interpretations of the enduring Yoreme communities in the Maya River Valley of present-day southern Sonora through an analysis of land titles and complementary documentary and anthropological testimonies. Its thesis underscores the historical significance of the ecological and cultural borderlands of the coastal and Piedmont biomes between the Sonoran Desert and the subtropical regions of Western Mesoamerica. Language plays a fundamental role in our interpretation of these rich archival sources. It helps us to understand the deeply rooted knowledge base that Indigenous peoples developed from the material and spiritual worlds through which they moved in seasonal patterns of migration and dwelling. It forms an essential part of the living histories we construct in collaboration with the Indigenous peoples that maintain their traditions in a radically transformed ecological region through ritual cycles and collective memories that derive their meaning from the natural world. Known as Mayos in the colonial nomenclature, meaning on the boundary, they identify as Yoreme or Yoremia, the people in relation to nature. Indigenous perceptions of their environment were rooted in the landscapes they had created in the course of pursuing subsistence strategies for centuries before European contact. The arid environments of the coastal plains and highland valleys bordering the Sonora and Chihuahua deserts required access to a diverse range of resources and ecological spaces. Following the initial violent encounters with early Spanish entradas, the Yoreme adapted their strategies for building a livelihood to the demands and opportunities of the colonial economy. Native rancherias, that is, small, movable settlements, coalesced into mission towns, whose internal economies combined traditional cropping and irrigation methods with European crops and livestock. Their settlement patterns were altered even further as they intersected with colonial enterprises of mining, livestock raising, and commercial agriculture that developed in northwestern New Spain. Yoreme territorial defense was based on combined practices of land use that included arable floodplains for cultivation, coastal estuaries for fishing, and the forests and grasslands for foraging. The term monte, which occurs in Spanish throughout the documentary record, and in common speech to refer to uncultivated spaces in forests, grasslands, and wetlands near rivers or coastal estuaries. The meanings ascribed to places and the intensity of the conflicts over basic resources stemmed from practices that linked labor to water, cropland, and the renewable vitality of vegetation and animal life in the monte. The northwestern Mexico constituted a series of overlapping borderlands, radiating northward from the tropical environments of the Gran Nayar, Chametla, and Culiacan to the arid lands of the Sonoran Desert. What the Spaniards first called Petaclan, the land of reed houses, described culturally produced spaces defined by four major river valleys: the Sinaloa, Suaque, or the Fuerte, the Mayo, and the Yaqui, moving from south to north, that flowed through slopes and canyons to water the coastal plains leading from the Sierra to the Gulf of California. Native peoples created these landscapes through their labor, knowledge, and ceremonial cycles across different ecological zones, extending eastward from the Gulf Coast through coastal beaches and brackish wetlands, networks of streams and floodplains, and the uncultivated monte of thorn forest, cacti, and hardwood trees. The indigenous peoples of this region defended these territories as what they called Itom Ania, our world, through their relationship to nature. These mosaics of distinctive geographical features were further inscribed with meaning by the spiritual power of Uya Ania that emanates from nature. In addition to the life-giving monte, the source for hunting, gathering medicinal plants, fruits, seeds, and building materials, Itom Ania embraced the sierras, the kawi, with hills and ranges whose names evoke stands of vegetation and types of boulders, small seasonal settlements, and the wasam, the cultivable farmland in the river valleys, pueblum, coming from pueblo, the villages that mark their domestic spaces, the ramadas, the arched shelters that we would call arbors for the rituals in the centers of local governance, and batwe, the streams and arroyos that flow into the main river channels and the maritime estuaries and open waters of the Gulf of California. The peoples of these four major river basins practiced floodplain farming and adapted Mesoamerican cultigens to these semi-arid but watered valleys. They developed local varieties of maize, squashes, beans, chilies, amaranthus, cotton, and tobacco, as well as root crops like camotes, which are sort of a type of sweet potato. Beyond the floodplains, along the arroyo beds and in small clearings throughout the monte, the Yoreme and neighboring peoples planted shifting milpas with periods of fallow. Their combined practices of planting, harvesting, and gathering redistributed different species of herbaceous plants, succulents like agaves and cacti. Indigenous communities of the highlands and river valleys both cultivated and gathered numerous varieties of edible and fibrous plants. Coastal mangroves and estuaries provided an abundance of fish, clams, freshwater shrimp, mollusks, and amphibians, as well as salt. Indigenous peoples who lived in these spaces moved seasonally through different biomes to create a mixed livelihood of farming, foraging, and trade. Indigenous landscapes were not timeless or changing, however, and their practices of planting, hunting, and foraging produced evolving and shifting borderlands. Indigenous skills for survival, learned through experimentation, created knowledge that was passed from one generation to another through quotidian practices, oral traditions, and rituals of song and dance. Recent archaeological findings suggest that the Fuerte River Valley, the valley just to the south of the Mayo River, was occupied continuously for at least 2,000 years. And the cultural roots of the historical communities of this region ran deep through changing environments from the Mocorito Valley in the south to the Yaqui River in the north. Analyses of ceramic, lithic, and shell remains for different sites in Sinaloa, Fuerte, and Mayo drainages support the hypothesis of continuous settlement with datable material for periods beginning about 300 BC and extending to European contact. Adapting to ecological transformations in these fluvial borderlands over a millennium, ethnic boundaries shifted within networks of chiefly alliances and rivalries among different bands of shifting rancherias and villages. The peoples of Sinaloa and Ostimuri, that is the provinces that became under Spanish rule, Sinaloa to the south and Ostimuri to the north, exhibited discernible patterns of livelihood and political organization that were different from the urban settlements of Culiacan and Acapulco to the south, and the villages of the eastern Sonoran highlands and the hunter-gatherers of the Sonoran Desert. A complex of villages known as Huatabampo developed on the coastal marshes of southern Sonora in the Mayo and Fuerte river valleys through agriculture and long-distance trade networks linked to Mesoamerica from about 200 before Christ to the mid-15th century AD. On the northern boundary of Petitlan, in the mid-Yaqui drainage and its tributaries, archaeological surveys of the Onabas Valley found evidence of trade with areas as distant as Huatabampo in the south and the Casas Grandes complex to the northeast, centered in Paquimé, in what today is northwestern Chihuahua. Clusters of agricultural villages throughout the alluvial valleys in Piedmont continued to thrive, producing food surpluses, tools, and prestige insignia like pearls, shells, obsidian, and cloth that maintained regional trade networks the Spaniards would encounter in the 16th century. The well-storied 16th century Spanish expeditions that first entered this region and passed through portions of Petitlan followed multilingual indigenous guides who had traveled from one province to another along trails that linked together coastal routes, highland ravines, and mountain passes. We'll turn now to the colonial borderlands. Spanish colonialism came to the Yoreme borderlands in the early 17th century through Jesuit missions and the mining industry. The Society of Jesus founded a network of mission towns from its base in the Colegio de San Felipe y Santiago in the Presidio and Villa of Sinaloa, extending through the river valleys of Sinaloa, Ostimuri, and Sonora. In mid-century, the frontiers of mission evangelization, advancing northward from the Villa de Sinaloa, met the mining frontier proceeding westward from Nueva Vizcaya. Mining began with silver strikes in the 1660s, deep in the Sierra, between the Yaqui and Mayo drainages. From the late 17th to the early 18th century, new mining centers opened in the region, and the Real de los Alamos became the principal commercial and administrative center for indigenous pueblos and Spanish settlements in the Mayo River Basin. And it remains as a kind of colonial settlement in southern Sonora. I'll take just a minute to point out a few things on this beautiful map. This map was produced by a Spanish military engineer, Francisco Álvarez Barrero, in 1727, who was part of the first Spanish inspection, the expedition that passed through all the presidios in northern New Spain. To the south, we see, as you can see, part of Culiacan and the, this is the Mayo River Valley, and here is the Real de los Alamos. And here we see, I think it's rather interesting, pointed out on this map, Casas Grandes and the Presidio of Janos. And these were 2 points from which people passed from Sonora going eastward into Nueva Vizcaya. This dotted line here indicates a portion of the Camino Real that connected these provinces west and east of the Sierra Madre Occidental. The land case that I will be talking about today occurred in the middle portion of the Mayo River. I will say that these upriver pueblos also were very tenacious in defending their lands over the course of the 18th century. The parallel development of missions and mining towns, or reales de minas, created conflicts involving labor and resources. The mines and surrounding settlements became markets for mission produce and livestock. But at the same time, missions became labor repositories for the mines through the supply of rotational workers recruited for specific places and time periods. This system of labor distribution became an important conduit of labor for the mines, often abusing the length of time allotted and effective payment. Parallel to the labor drafts, Indians traveled on their own to the mines, incorporating paid labor into their patterns of seasonal migration. Over time, colonists and pueblos competed ever more rigorously for indigenous workers and for the productive resources of croplands, pasturage, woodlands, and water in streams and springs. Colonial boundaries were negotiated over more than 3 centuries through different practices of defining space and allocating resources in a mixed thorn forest and riparian environment, extending from the basin and range topography of the Sierra Madre Occidental to the deltas, wetlands, and estuaries of the Gulf Coast. The Jesuit missions were intended to bring scattered indigenous settlements into permanent villages, but in practice they became an interface between the rancherias that supported the Indians' seasonal movements through different biomes and the ceremonial and political centers of the reducciones, or the missions. As the Spanish population grew with expansion of mining and livestock ranching, the institutional status of the missions under colonial law protected indigenous agricultural lands and portions of the monte, where native shepherds and cowhands tended mission herds. Yet mission lands were not necessarily contiguous or clearly bounded. Rather, separate parcels of croplands dependent on rainfall or the seasonal flow of intermittent streams and grasslands mixed with thorn forest were occupied at different times by both indigenous and Spanish cultivators, pastoralists, and foragers. These pieces of land, called parajes, which simply translates to place, were irregularly shaped stretches of monte, and they were named, often with indigenous toponyms that revealed locally recognized histories of occupation and use. Over the course of the 18th century, colonial authorities in Nueva Vizcaya, Sinaloa, and Sonora pressured Spanish vecinos, that is, Hispanic resident heads of households, to regularize their occupation of public lands nominally owned by the crown, called tierras realengas, through a legal process involving the payment of royal fees to carry out their measurement, public auction, and issuance of title that turned them into discreetly bounded pieces of private property. Private landholdings evolved from use rights, negotiated through verbal agreements, to demarcated entitled properties that superseded informal arrangements for sharing pasturage and water or transferring use rights through purchase and inheritance. Formal land ownership with measured boundaries and property markers ran counter to indigenous practices of land use and access based on seasonal occupation of the monte and the resources of water, forests, and wildlife sheltered within it. Now we'll turn to the next 2 slides that just show some examples of place names and food sources taken from the monte. The first of these, the food sources, come from some of what we see in the literature, in the ethnographic literature, and from conversations that I had in the pueblo of Coarimpo over the past 2 years in the Mayo River Valley. If we can go to the next slide, please. These are well known to many of us who live or have lived in the region. Agaves are a source of food and fiber, medicinal goods, as well as soap and fermented drink. The hito appears also, a number of these terms appear in the various land titles. So we're seeing here products from different types of cacti, the pod with the seeds from the mesquite, which is a source of nourishment, as well as the fruit of the nopal, the pitaya, the quelites, which are the leaves and the stems of the amaranthus, which is kind of a wild spinach, pinole, which is a way of processing corn, and strips of squashes that were dried and then could be stored for some time. The next slide shows us some of the place names that come from the land titles that I have studied for this region over the course of the 18th century. And many of them refer to plants in relationship to water. Bacabachi, refers either to the local strain of maize, the kind of land race of corn, also to seeds of the carrizo tree. And if you remember, this whole region was called Petatlan, or the place of reed houses. And the carrizo is a type of native bamboo that grows in the marshy areas of this region and is one of the major, even today, one of the major building materials for the walls of houses. There are references here to salty water, to plants that grow in the marshlands and in the wetlands. Capitamaya, that we'll be referring to, is the place from which a fishing hook is thrown, suggesting its closeness to the river. Coahuirimpo, which is one of the main pueblos now in the middle portion of the Mayo River, refers to a kind of oxbow where the river turns back against itself. Navajoa, that we'll be referring to, it refers to the place or the house of the tuna, which is the fruit of the nopal cactus, and so forth. So nature is drawn into these kinds of landmarks, the kinds of names that were given to places. So we'll turn now to the defense of the monte. In the middle portion of the Mayo River drainage, where the floodplains widen to support extensive croplands, the pueblos of Camoa, Tesia, Navajoa, and Coahuirimpo straddled both the northern and southern banks of the river. The indigenous Cabildo officers of Navajoa became the principal litigants in this case, representing the entire village in their demand to maintain the riparian wetlands and scrub forest that surrounded their croplands as open monte, not to be measured or adjudicated to private owners. Together with the officers of Tesia, they claimed these tierras realengas by right of possession, and quote, because the king, in his mercy, had given them the lands that were left unmeasured between the boundaries of neighboring villages and private holdings. The contentious arguments recorded in the field and entered into the court proceedings in the Audiencia of Guadalajara hinged on the meanings of possession. Their dissonance rose from the distinct ways of securing a livelihood and dwelling in the land. In this particular case, Don Manuel Ignacio Valenzuela, a vecino, that is, a Spanish resident of the Villa of Sinaloa, filed a claim to uncultivated lands between his ranch of Usibampo and the pueblo of Navajoa before the magistrate in charge of land sales in the Audiencia of Guadalajara, a judge who was named Martinez de Aguirre y Viana. The Audiencia was the principal judicial body that had jurisdiction over the entire western and northwestern portions of colonial Mexico. In June 1787, the judge commissioned Juan Maria de Figueroa, who lived in Alamos, to survey the land surrounding the ranch of Usibampo. He ordered Figueroa to measure or estimate the distances between Navajoa and Usibampo and project them in a map, to determine how much land the Indians of Navajoa cultivated and how much they used beyond their croplands, and to report the number of indigenous families living in Navajoa, measure all the land contained in the area over which Valenzuela had filed a claim, and determine its intrinsic worth. Figueroa fulfilled this demanding commission only partially. He did not actually measure most of the lands in question. Rather, he merely estimated their circumference and extension. Nor did he get an accurate count of the population of Navajoa. If he drew a map, it is not included in the archive. His report, however, revealed key aspects of the human ecology of the Mayo River Basin and surrounding monte in the late 18th century, as well as the conflicting notions of territoriality expressed by indigenous communities, Hispanic landowners, and the officials charged with determining property boundaries, awarding land titles, and collecting the corresponding royal fees. This case involved 3 Yoreme pueblos, Navajoa, Tesia, and Camoa, in the Middle Mayo River. In late February 1788, Figueroa assumed his commission and sent a citation to Valenzuela, who in turn named a representative to defend his interests in Usibampo. and the surrounding monte. Likewise, Figueroa summoned the indigenous officers of Navajoa, naming those who responded to witness the survey and defend their pueblo's lands and boundaries. And these documents do give us the opportunity actually to identify individual Indians who were involved in these historical actions and processes. Nicolás Cubil was the governor of the pueblo, and the council members included Ignacio Raqui, José Manuel, Vidal Melchior, Usacamea, Juan Ignacio Arce, Ramón Baqui, Fernando Baquide, José Matías Machiri, Ignacio Anuamea, José Quiroga, Oni Agustín, y Nomamea. And the Indians felt it was very important to come to these land measurements, bringing the entire council with them. Figueroa read to them out loud the order he had received from the audiencia judge in Guadalajara, to which they responded that they heard and understood it. Nicolás Cubil signed this portion of Figueroa's auto as the official record of the proceedings in representation of all the village officers, together with Figueroa and one Hispanic witness named Simón de Santelicer. The following day, Governor Cubil and his fellow council members walked with Figueroa along the perimeter of all the croplands that were cultivated by the villagers of Navajoa, accompanied by the witnesses Miguel María de Figueroa and Simón Santelicer, the former charged with counting cord lengths and estimating the distances they traversed. In effect, the indigenous council members led him downstream toward the west, following the riverbank until they reached the limits that the Mayos of Navajoa recognized between their pueblo and the lands of Coarimpo, the next pueblo downstream. All along this transect, Figueroa observed cultivated land, some of it dependent on seasonal rainfall, and other parts watered by the highland streams that replenished the main floodplain. Figueroa estimated its length in about 5.7 kilometers. At this point, he and the Navajoa officers crossed the river and turned to the north, passing through watered cropland for a distance that Figueroa estimated in about 2.25 kilometers. Turning eastward on the northern bank of the river, Figueroa, the Mayos, and the two witnesses walked upstream along the river's edge, a distance of about 11.4 kilometers, to reach the limits between Navajoa and the next pueblo upstream, Tesia. At this juncture, they crossed the river turning south, walking for another 50 cords, and then turned eastward for an equal transect of another 125 cords. They measured these distances in a linear way with cords that were knotted at a length of 50 varas, and a vara is about a yard. Their survey traced an approximate rectangle along the full width of the floodplain, running parallel to the river and returning to the pueblo. Figueroa estimated the circumference of the entire area in approximately 24 square kilometers. He noted further, all along these cultivated lands, seasonal plantings in the washes, where the humidity of the soil would allow crops to germinate and mature. Thus, Nicolás Cubil and the officers of Navajoa led Judge Surveyor Juan María de Figueroa to confirm their pueblo's possession of the Wasam, the lands that bordered the floodplain, for planting and harvesting. And I have taken the liberty to substitute. As I say, there is no map, unfortunately, for this particular case. But this plano, which is one of the best ones that I have found in these land titles, and that actually comes from Mexico's National Archive, is for a neighboring property from the same period of time. Capitamaya is the hacienda within the square. And what we notice here is the practice of expanding private properties by extending their edges in what were considered to be these untitled open lands. And here we see the boundaries with another private property called Soledad. And here we see the boundary with the pueblo of Navajoa, and here the boundary with the pueblo of Coarimpo. So we see how in this linear fashion that was meant to kind of simulate the measurements on the ground, that the boundaries of the pueblos were recognized. The dialogue took a sharper tone, however, when Figueroa turned to the Thorn forest that the people of Navajoa enjoyed by right of possession, but without cultivating it as cropland. Figueroa made the striking statement that north of the Pueblo, these lands were limitless, extending as far as 30 leagues to the margin of the Gagi River. Looking south of the Pueblo, Governor Nicolas Cubil asked Judge Figueroa to establish the boundaries of Navajoa's lands at the same time that he measured the portion of the monte that lay adjacent to Valenzuela's holdings in Usibampo. Figueroa verbally assented and issued an auto, which issued a written statement stipulating that he would give the governor a copy of this agreement in writing. On February 28th, the entire commission convened for the land survey, set out to walk through the monte, leading southward from the Pueblo. When they arrived at the boundary marker for another private property, another ranch called St. Joseph of the Retreat, Governor Cubil declared that he did not consent to the measurement of these lands in favor of Valenzuela because they belonged to Navajoa, and the villagers had no other grazing land for their livestock. Valenzuela's representative insisted that the survey proceed as ordered by the judge in Guadalajara. Figueroa then crossed the line between the lands recognized as belonging to the Pueblo of Tesia and those of this San Josef del Retiro, St. Joseph of the Retreat. Standing there, he turned to the governor and council members of Tesia, who responded in unison with the governor of Navajoa that they did not consent to the measurement of these lands because the king had awarded them to their Pueblo. Nevertheless, they deferred to Figueroa's authority on the strength of the order issued by the audiencia judge, telling him to act as he thought best. Overriding the objections of the indigenous officers of both Tesia and Navajoa, Figueroa proceeded in early March to carry out the survey from the ranch of Usibampo, where he had summoned the officers of the Pueblo of Camoa, the Pueblo upstream from Tesia. When he announced to them the order that he had received from the audiencia, the Camoa officers responded that, quote, they had nothing to say and acceded to the measurement of the land bordering their Pueblo. Accompanied by the witnesses, Figueroa estimated the area that corresponded to Valenzuela's claim as about 4 sitios for running livestock, but he dispensed with their measurement in order not to increase the costs that would accrue to him for securing title to the land. 2 local vecinos testified as to the value of the land, which they estimated in a little over 100 pesos, a sum on which Valenzuela would have paid an additional amount in taxes and fees to the royal treasury had he completed the process of securing title to the land. Governor Nicolas Cubil and the councilmen of Navajoa and Tesia registered their protest over the measurement of the Tierra Realenga that extended between their pueblos and Usibampo before the magistrate in the Real de los Alamos, who forwarded their signed statements to the protector of Indians in the Audiencia of Guadalajara. In other words, they made use of legal instances and institutions with which they were now familiar. As they had done in person before Don Juan Maria de Figueroa, the indigenous officers defended their right of prior possession according to the primacy awarded to them by the sovereign, the longevity of their occupation of these lands, and their need for these lands in which to pasture their livestock. Magistrate in Zavala in Guadalajara ordered that until the judge in charge of all land issues ruled on the case, the indigenous villagers should continue to exercise their use rights to these lands according to their custom. In his role as the commissioned surveyor, Figueroa had requested the census corresponding to the Pueblo of Navajoa in order to comply with the orders he had received from Judge Martinez de Aguirre in Guadalajara. Figueroa counted 100 families in the mission census, but doubted its veracity because, he said, you could find no more than 10, quote, poorly built houses within the village perimeter. This statement does not ring true, however, because of the figures in the bishop's census carried out 4 years prior in 1784, and because of what we know about patterns of settlement and livelihood. The bishop's census showed 140 families and 350 persons in Navajoa, 95 families with 300 persons in Tesia, and 35 families with 90 persons in Camoa. The population of all 4 villages was mixed at this point among Yoreme, Spaniards, and mixed groups. Figueroa opined that the Pueblo's scant population undermined their alleged need for the land they so staunchly defended, an argument that Valenzuela's attorney repeated vociferously before the audiencia. Determined to promote the privatization of this royal common land, Figueroa willfully denied the enduring pattern of rancherias, in which clusters of families distributed themselves along the length of the floodplain to cultivate their milpas and procure a wide variety of plants and wildlife in the marshes and upland monte. Their huts of reed mats and puddled adobe provided shelter and served them in their seasonal movements through thorn scrub, wetlands, and highland deciduous forest. Maneuvering between deference and defiance, the governors and village officers of Tesia and Navajoa gave expression to the conflicting practices of land use in the open spaces of the monte. Leaders like Nicolás Cubil navigated the judicial and administrative institutions of local governance and the Audiencia of Guadalajara to assert their usufruct rights and access to both the cultivated floodplain and the resources of the thorn forest. Their ways of dwelling between the Wasam and the Monte clashed, however, with notions of titled ownership to measured pieces of land and its value in monetary terms. Indigenous Pueblos were caught between the customary rights they defended and the commercialization of the land and its resources, a process in which they participated through breeding their own livestock and trading their produce and labor in the colonial markets. Governor Cubil and his fellow officers forestalled the division and enclosure of the monte surrounding Navajoa and Usipampo with the simple words, "We do not consent." In the following decade, as Captain General of the Rio Mayo, Nicolás Cubil defended the Pueblos during repeated land surveys throughout the Mayo River Basin, when the process of issuing land titles gained greater momentum. The corpus of land titles generated over a century shows the gradual dispossession of indigenous communal lands in favor of privately held landed properties. To read them only in this way, however, would deny the perseverance of individuals and communities among the Yoreme and their neighboring peoples who intervened in the contentious histories of enclosing the open territory of the Monte. For us and the indigenous peoples of the present day, these documents provide a wealth of information about the natural environment and the landscapes that their ancestors created, confirming their own stores of knowledge and opening pathways to future possibilities for restoring their ecological patrimony. The elders of Coarimbo met nearly a decade ago to compile the conversations, essays, and verses that compose this book, entitled Una espina es un bosque de advertencias. A thorn is a grove of warnings or admonitions. It upholds community, even when the reduced communal land holdings of Coarimbo are surrounded by private properties, and it defines that community largely in terms of its moral values and its relationship to nature. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was wonderful. Let me get back to my notes here. See if we have questions. So now we are open for questions and answers. Anybody who has questions for Cynthia, for Dr. Radding, please put your question in the chat. We will put you in the virtual queue. When it's your turn, we will unmute you, but the process is now a little bit different. We have to ask you to unmute yourself, and then you will be able to ask your question directly to Cynthia. And while you are getting your questions ready, I have a question for you, Cynthia. I wondered if you could speak a bit about the archival process that how you're working in the archives. And I'm especially interested in the relationship between what you're finding in local archives versus what you're finding in larger national archives.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. Yes, this has been, this is formed a major part of the book that I am working on and now fairly close to finishing. And the archival trail leads from the local state archive in Sonora. The Sonora has really an excellent state archive, which is largely centered on the 19th and 20th centuries, but it has a whole section of the archive devoted to what they call land titles. And it's organized by judicial district. So in order to concentrate on the Mayo River Valley, I just took mostly the Alamos judicial district, and there are over 100 of the land titles just corresponding to this. And these are actually partly administrative documents. In other words, they keep adding on to them as these lands changed hands. So they show, many of them anyway, show really a wonderful history, and many of them go back to the 18th century. And I want to say that a number of people helped me with this, and Jose Manuel Moreno Vega, who is here with us, very kindly helped me with photocopying some of them and recovering some photographs that had been taken before. And a very kind gentleman in Hermosillo, whom I met working in the archive, also helped me photograph the documents that I did not have time to transcribe. But I transcribed some of them, I photographed a lot of them, and these, having produced this digital copy of the archives, I think is an important byproduct of the research, because the archive is in somewhat precarious condition now, and this is really creating a digital copy of a very important source. Now, these, there is also a collection of documents that's very important in Culiacan, because at one time, Sinaloa and Sonora were the same state, and I have not seen those documents in Culiacan. There is also a section on land titles in Guadalajara. As I said, the audiencia, this court really, the judicial court that had jurisdiction over all of Western and Northwestern Mexico, produced an enormous archive, as any of us who have worked on it know. And part of it is in Spain, actually, and part of it is in Guadalajara, preserved in the public library in Guadalajara. And there's a section of that archive dedicated to land titles. And then the National Archive in Mexico, the Archivo General de la Nación, has a huge section devoted to tierras, to lands. Most of that deals with central Mexico, but there is really a rich collection there of land titles. And at the end of the colonial period, the final approval of the privatization of these properties actually went to the Viceroyalty, to Mexico City. So some of the final documents end up there.
That's so interesting. I'm always interested in the relationship between and how the documents were moving in their day and how they've been moved since then as well. So, and how as historians we have to piece those things together, I think is fascinating. Thank you. We have a question from William Fisher. I'm going to ask you to unmute now. There we go.
Hello, yes,
William.
And I can't see anybody, but that's okay. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Cynthia. I have a sort of basic question about the size of the populations involved, and given the environment, I imagine people moved around, and just could you add that dimension into what you've already said and help us understand the sorts of scale and maybe the issues of flexibility of I mean, there were boundaries, but people must have moved across boundaries. So I guess that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Bill Fisher is a member of our board on the Americas Research Network, and we're very delighted that you're with us today. As I mentioned, there was a bishop's survey, a bishop's census, a fairly thorough census that was taken in the mid-1780s, and also earlier in the 1760s. There are important censuses done. So we do have population counts that mainly were done through the missionaries themselves, first the Jesuits and then the secular bishops, and that's our main source of population data. If you think back to the map on which I paused, you might have noticed all those little circles along the river valleys. I do want to emphasize that even though population was less dense than, say, in central Mexico, this was not sparsely populated. This was not a place of just people, you know, people think of it, oh, everybody was nomads. No, these were people, as I kind of said over and over in my talk, who had farming villages, but you're right, Bill, I also emphasized that they had to move around to different biomes within the areas in which they lived. Now, the pre-contact estimates for population in the Yaqui, Mayo, Fuerte, and Sinaloa river valleys really extend from a high of about 60,000 people in each of those river valleys. And the population that was estimated by the Jesuits when they arrived there in the very early 17th century was around 30,000 people, you know, roughly estimated for the in each of these river valleys. And this would diminish under the impact of epidemics during the early contact period, which for this area was really the 17th century. But by the 18th century, the indigenous population was recovering and the Hispanic population was growing. If I don't have the numbers memorized, but if I remember correctly, the bishop's census in 1784 produced about between 19 and 20,000 people for each of these river valleys, for the Yaqui, the Mayo, the Fuerte, and the Sinaloa. And these were and continue to be, the Mayos today are the most populous of the indigenous peoples, the 6 or 7 major indigenous groups living in Sonora today. And the Mayos are in both Sinaloa and in Sonora.
Okay, we don't have any other questions right now. But we still have some time. If anyone has another question, please. I have another question, so I will. I'll just dominate the question and answers today. But I'm wondering, thinking about your body of work about the borderlands, and that from your first book, Wandering Peoples, to this new project, how do you see, particularly in respect to the environment, how do you see how your work has evolved over time, and in that kind of dual part of the sort of that relationship between borderlands and environmental history?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, in terms of, I guess in terms of my work, Wandering Peoples was focused on the central and northern parts of Sonora, the areas that really are part of the Sonoran Desert. And then my second book, Landscapes of Power and Identity, I made a deliberate comparison between this area, which in general is identified as sort of semi-arid, and what are the eastern borderlands of Bolivia, which is east of the Andes Cordillera, which is largely subtropical. So I was comparing 2 different geographical regions and asking the question, what is the impact of geography or the environment in historical processes? I was not trying to say, how does the environment cause historical outcomes, but what is the impact in historical processes, by deliberately making this contrast. And for this third book, I first had an extremely ambitious idea that I was going to cover areas as far east as Coahuila and kind of through New Mexico and down into Sonora. And then I realized that this was simply unworkable. So what I did do was move kind of south into this area of the Yaqui and Mayo and Fuerte valleys. As many of you know, the area of the Yaqui Valley has been quite heavily studied. So I kind of turned to the Mayo Valley and found, just found a wealth of material. And a wealth of material historically and a wealth of material also. I really learned to go more deeply into the ethnographic literature, and had the privilege over the time that I was in Mexico from 2017 to 18 to get to know people in the village of Coarimpo, and to get to know Mexican ethnographers who are working very closely with them. And this is where I was able to really get more of a sensitivity to the relationship between environment and the way people themselves conceive of place and space. And I see that David Fry has a general question about borders, but I'll say what I was trying to project today is not the notion of borders between provinces or sort of grand notion of borderlands, but what was this very kind of intimate on the ground process of what in English we know as enclosure. And what we can learn from these land titles that were put together for a legal and fiscal purpose, but what we can learn from them about the environment and about ecology. And let me say that we're very, questions in Spanish will be most welcome. And
Absolutely. And I'm sorry that I didn't make that point, but please, por favor, si quieren preguntarle en español, todo está bien. Okay, I'm unmuting David Fry. David, you have to... Sorry, David, we can't hear you.
he's still muted. He said he has a general question about borders.
There. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I've asked there. Are you there, David? No, we're hearing something, but it sounds like there's something wrong with your connection. If you'd like to write your question, I'd be happy to read it to the...
Oh, there's a question here about weather or natural events. To some extent, yes. The missions, for example, yes, that's an excellent question. In some of the archaeological data that I had summarized extremely briefly, suggests, for example, this pre-Hispanic site of Huatabampo, which was just, well, south of what today is the delta and the mouth of the Mayo River, was a fairly important urban center with some of the characteristics of Mesoamerica. One of the hypotheses is that in a major flood, the river actually moved, or the course of the river moved. And so this may have been one of the causes for Huatabampo to decline. And it definitely, this site had declined a couple of centuries before the Spaniards arrived in the area. But there are a number of, well, of course, the missions will, in the missionary records, they talk about times of drought or floods. And often the missionaries moved villages, either because they had put them in the wrong place and they were subject to flooding, or because floods occurred. And the most of the farming done in the Yaqui and Mayo and Fuerte River valleys was floodplain farming. And the first missionaries who begin to describe this area in the 1590s are very impressed with the quantity of the harvests and the fact that the indigenous peoples had 2 crops per year, and they're very insistent on that. They all say they have 2 crops per year. But then they talk about as early as 1604, for example, either through flooding or through lack of rains, they lost the crop that year. They're also in the oral traditions in the early 20th century, there was flooding that caused people to move an entire village. This affected Coarimpo at one point. And it's interesting that floods, partly from the biblical story, but partly from their own experience, flooding is a big part of kind of their legends in this region. So very definitely caused people to move. In the Yaqui River, there is a portion of the river that actually kind of comes off going to the northeast, and then following its own course to the Gulf of California, that is called the Rio Muerto, the dead river, because it ceased to flow and left two of the pueblos kind of without water.
Okay. See, we're waiting for David's question. And see if that comes up.
It is certainly true that in the period that I'm writing about, these property boundaries were not well fixed, and really wouldn't be until the coming of barbed wire, that would really allow people to mark off predios, and so cattle, of course, would move back and forth, and what they would do is, oh, there we go.
Okay.
What they would do is mark what they called the landmarks, the mojoneras, which were where these lines sort of that were traced. They actually would walk in the fields where they met. But these were often disputed, and so lands would be remeasured. Let's see what his
I'm going to read it
is.
out loud for the video. So this is from David Fry. This is maybe too general, but I noticed years ago what seemed to me to be a difference between English and Spanish settler colonizing regimes in the way they formed borders. For the English colonies, the borders came first, and the colonies over time pushed up against the borders that had been drawn on a map. For the Spanish, the system seemed to establish a center, typically a town or city under Spanish rule, and push out from there until its jurisdiction ran into another one. And then they would try to figure out the boundaries. I think this does make sense. And Cynthia, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good observation. And what I have been observing in these land titles that I've been analyzing is that they do kind of begin in the monte. However, they would begin the measurements for something that they designated as a centro, as a center. And if it was village land or pueblo land, you're right, David, that they would usually start at the church. It was where the owner, in this case, the Indian community, wanted them to start. And in the case of setting up private property, it's where the claimant wanted them to start. And they would start with something, which was either the house where the person lived, or a well, or a corral, usually some kind of built structure. And yes, then they would measure out in the 4 cardinal points. And then they would say what they would square the measurement, as they called it. And this is when they would then go from each of the cardinal points and sort of estimate where the corner would be, and then turn in the corresponding direction. Yeah, and I think he's right about the actual way people measured was not that much different for the English, but I think he's right that they would sort of fill in.
Okay, Val Setterholm has a question. I'm going to ask to unmute you now, Val. There we go. Are you there?
Hi.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I was just wondering about the social purpose of, or social project of your writing, whether you intend the publication and analysis of these juridical records to help serve the interests of Pueblos today. How does publication help make the case for litigants or potential litigants today in the Mayo River Valley?
Thank
so of course you. Yes, sure. Thank you.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all. And just very curious about that. It's a question of readership and use of your material, which is very interesting to everybody. But how is it of particular use to people in the Mayo River Valley today?
Yes, I have taken, no, I do want it to be of use to them. And on 2 occasions, I took the transcriptions that I have made of these documents, both from Sonora and from Mexico City, in printed form, and then I gave them a USB. There are people and this is in the community of Coarimpo, and I gave them the information that I had gotten from the archive, hoping that it is useful to them, and they said it is. And they are trying to recover some of the land surrounding their pueblo. So I definitely agree that this work is important insofar as it can be of social use to the people, the descendants of the people about whom I'm writing. And this is why I included the book at the end that has been published in Spanish, and we're hoping in the future to try to be able to publish a part of it in the Yoreme language.
Oh, yes. Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Val. Thank you for that question.
Okay, so we have our last question now from Dana Murillo. I'm asking to unmute you now, Dana. There you go. You have the floor.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Dana. Thank you for coming.
So, Cynthia, I have just a kind of a general question for you. You say that this manuscript is almost complete, and I was just wondering, overall, how much of an insight you were able to get into women in these communities. And also, I was just wondering, between this book and your other two books, were there kind of any methodological innovations, that transpired in the course of writing this book? You talked about using those archives in Guadalajara, which I've used as well, and there are a lot, and it's a lot to get through. But any methodological innovations? And I guess my question for you is, where do you see this work sitting in the ethnohistorical field right now? Especially with the way that ethnohistory has kind of been moving towards, I don't know, almost a more global sense. And how do you feel that these types of works are kind of situated in the field right now?
Okay, thank you. This is a multiple question. Coming back to the question of women, and I know you're working on this in a very imaginative way for the Chichimecas. It is more difficult to find them in the archive. As you may remember from my work on Wandering Peoples, everywhere I could find them in terms of, and sometimes it was a very sort of fleeting reference where the priest was giving out measurements of corn to women in the village and sort of their role in food processing. In the early chapters of the book, of this book on Bountiful Deserts, where I take up the period of the early expeditions, the role of women as interpreters comes out, even though these are a few women, but it comes out in a very detailed way of how important they were to the Spanish expeditions, particularly the expedition of Ibarra. And there are fleeting references to women, usually as the wives of Indigenous officers. I'll link that question to your question about methodology. In some ways, what I've done with this book is practice what I've done in my previous work, which is try to combine quantitative analysis, as I've done with particular variables within these land titles, and quantitative analysis of the different censuses over time, together with qualitative analysis of texts. And I guess one methodological, for me, which was new, was the ways in which I've really tried to incorporate ethnographic testimonies into the historical text that I'm writing. And for the chapter that completed this summer, which is kind of a new way of interpreting what was a fairly major revolt in the 1740s that involved the Yaqui and the Mayo and some of the other indigenous peoples. And I used some of one of the missionaries in particular produced his sort of diary of what was happening in the months leading up to it, and also went through and interrogated people and had a notary although this was really kind of an improvised notary who would sign each of these. And a number of times women come up in these little episodes. So to me, it was kind of, it was an innovation for me as to how to interpret this, not to take it literally, but what do we see through that, through this missionary's clear statement of his own fear of the hostility that was building up, and what were the issues that that Indigenous people were raising in terms of access to food, in terms of control over the missions. And this is a century and a half after they were founded. So how I was able to, I think, kind of tease out and interpret struggles for power through, admittedly, through a colonial document, but through a colonial document in which Indigenous voices really do appear. Oh, and then how does this work fit in this field of ethnohistory? I think and I hope it gives at least two contributions. One is kind of returning to and showing how deeply grounded archival work can produce good ethnohistorical and original interpretations. And the other is how each of us is working in a region, really, and how these regional histories, how we learn to see them and portray them as part of something larger. And I was just recently reminded in rereading some of the essays by Ignacio del Rio, who is a Mexican historian whom many of us deeply respect and lament his passing in 2015. And he wrote a number of essays about how regional history is not just little history. It's history grounded in a region that is part of something larger. Thank you very much, Dana. That's a really good observation.
Okay, thank you all for your questions. And let me do a quick screen share. I'm gonna conclude for today. Here we go. First and foremost, I would like to thank Cynthia Radding for her wonderful presentation, and especially for all of the work that she does for ARENET as the chair of our board. I would also like to thank Greta de Leon, the executive director of ARENET. She is also the co-host of our series of Zoom talks, and today she's working the tech behind the scenes. And mil gracias to all of you for joining us today. It has been a long, difficult 2020, and we are especially grateful that you have been able to join us this year, even when it could only be virtually. We have lots of exciting plans for 2021, with fingers crossed that many of them will be in person after a vaccine. But we will also continue to bring together scholars, students, and communities virtually. We have a full slate of programs for January, including a focus on the Pacific in our Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace series, and a presentation by ARENET and Coling Fellows on Nahuatl language medical resources. In the meantime, season's greetings to all of you, and take good care of yourselves and each other.